Next from Springfield, Senate Majority Leader John Cullerton reacts to Governor Rauner's budget address. This runs about 25 minutes.
Be happy with the idea that the governor is making education a priority. That's a positive thing. The problem is that we have the worst school funding formula in the nation, by far. And on top of that, we have probably the worst state in the nation in terms of funding education from the state level. So the governor didn't really focus on changing the formula. We can't just spend more money with a broken formula because we will end up with unequal outcomes. So we need to have a complete overhaul of the school funding formula. And the other important point is that we are not asking for any kind of a bailout for Chicago. It's not going to happen. I'm not in favor of a bailout for Chicago. I'm in favor of a funding formula and fairness. The governor is inaccurate to say that Chicago gets an extra $600 million. It's not true. The fact is that Chicago gets no money to speak of at all from the state for its pensions, whereas every other school district does. That should be corrected. Any special deals in the formula should be eliminated. There should be one formula for the whole state. And the goal of that change in the formula would be to focus education dollars where there's a concentration of poverty. And that will probably benefit not just Chicago, but also East St. Louis and Taylorville and other poor school districts. Now, the other thing that's very alarming is that the governor has basically proposed legislation that would allow him to raid monies from the pension funds, from the local government's money, to start the idea of skipping pension payments again when we have such a bad pension funding problem is the wrong thing to do. We haven't done that since Governor Blagojevich was here, and so Governor Rauner has proposed the Blagojevich move, which is really not a good idea. Instead, he should acknowledge that his budget is at least $3.5 billion out of whack, that we have said from the start, focus on the budget, not this unrelated turnaround agenda. The Speaker and I have been consistent. We're willing to talk to him about cuts, revenue, or a combination thereof. And he doesn't seem to be focused on doing that. Instead, he's asking for a turnaround agenda, which really has nothing to do directly with the state budget. He's proposing things which are really dramatic and radical compared to the idea of not having a budget for 8.5 months. We've indicated to him we're willing to talk about workers' comp reforms. Keeping in mind we passed a major workers' comp reform bill 4 years ago, and we've had dramatic cuts, almost 20% cuts in premiums. We've said we're willing to talk about collective bargaining issues, but not putting the unions out of business. I mean, he couldn't pass that in some Republican-dominated state legislatures. So the other thing that I think is kind of fundamental, if we pass a budget that the governor thinks is out of whack, he can mandatorily veto the budget. He can reduce the line items. And that's in the Constitution. So he has that authority to do it. He should have done it last year. Senator Berdogno, at his request, has introduced Senate Bill 2789, allows for skipping pension payments, raiding local government funds. It's not a good idea. We're more than halfway through a budget year with no budget. And now we're debating what could best be described as sketches for a budget for next year. So it almost wasn't a budget address. Be happy to answer any questions.
You know, dealing from the pension fund and municipal budgets, you're talking about this extraordinary power to cut spending or to balance the
raid.
his own-
Yeah, we have a law that says you have to make the pension payments.
Right.
It's a continuing appropriation. Same thing with the local government distributive fund.
His call, though, that he get this power.
Change that law so that we don't have to make those pension payments. We don't have to give the money to local governments. That's what he wants to do. That's what our bill does. That's a bad idea. That's what he's asking for specifically. He doesn't want to not pay debt. They excluded that from the law, but they want to allow, he wants to be allowed to skip pension payments instead of sitting down and negotiating a budget. He says he's open to revenue. Let's talk about it. How much do you need? What do you want to cut to make up the difference? But not skip pension payments. And I'm personally not in favor of giving local governments less money because that's keeping the property taxes lower than they otherwise would be.
You said this was a sketch. Are you disappointed by the lack of detail provided by the governor's office today, either in the speech or even after, as far as how to fix the budget?
Yes, I am disappointed in the proposal that he made today because it's not a clear path for how we should have a balanced budget for next year. It's out of whack for the second year in a row.
Senator, that's what I was going to ask. Have you had a chance to review his numbers, and is his budget balanced?
No, the budget's not balanced. We haven't had much time. They didn't, the previous governors would share with us the day before the budget so we can look at it, and frequently our staff would be up all night and have a budget book, and we'd have a caucus, and we'd know what was going to be in here. His budget proposal today, it was, I guess the most important part of it was the parts where the Republicans were supposed to applaud. That was in the budget, but not what, the numbers that make it balanced.
The $600 million, he says that Chicago's getting outsized state money equaling $600 million. Have you talked to him about this?
I talked to him yesterday, and I told him that he had made that statement before. Senator Verdonio has made that statement before. And we had a long conversation. I went through as many of those points that he, in the calculations of the $600 million. And I don't know where it went because it didn't change his speech. There's a local government, there's a block grant that Chicago gets where it's a different formula for special education than the rest of the state. Chicago gets some extra money there. We propose to eliminate that. There's also a special deal where Chicago doesn't get any money for their normal costs for the pension funds. That's $197 million. They're not getting. Those two are about a wash. But a new school aid formula would help all school districts that have a lot of poverty, which is where we are deficient in our formula. I explained that to him. The other dollars that she claims we're not getting were esoteric things like the personal property replacement tax, so I went into a history of that and why that calculation was inaccurate. The block grant for special ed is a wash. Chicago doesn't get a special deal. So these numbers have been around. They've been debunked in the past. A lot of the statistics that the governor used were not accurate, would be a polite way of putting them. And, you can only fact check as quickly as you can, but believe me, will show that a lot of the statistics were not accurate.
It seems like when you've had conversations with the governor on the day before, like when the governor announced the joint pension reform a few weeks ago, that there was a miscue of what he was going to say, and now you're talking about that you went through the $600 million with him yesterday, and then in the speech you sort of heard.
Well,
so, can you trust this?
Well,
governor?
we hadn't, maybe we hadn't convinced him that the numbers were wrong. With regard to the pensions, I talked to him about the pension bill yesterday. And I told him it's very difficult to pass a pension bill when the unions are against it. And I told him that we were still working, the lawyers were actually still working with the language. His lawyers had given our lawyer a suggestion that they were trying to draft. He expects to just put a bill in and pass it, and this is very difficult.
My question is, has it been different working behind the scenes with Governor Rauner and then hearing Governor Rauner talk publicly? Has it been like two different governors, it seems?
It's been different. I would agree with that part of the statement.
Well, after a year of having Bruce Rauner as the state's governor and then listening to what he had to say today, what optimism is there that you're gonna get to a place where you can negotiate?
Well, the mayor of Woodstock was just in my office, that's where they filmed the Groundhog Day. So I don't know what to tell you. He didn't have a balanced budget last year, and he doesn't have a balanced budget this year. And it's not that complex. The taxes went down, there's a big deficit. We're willing to work with him, we say, on revenue, which he says he's open to, cuts, or a combination thereof. But he doesn't want to do that yet because he wants to talk about workers' comp, and he referred to it again, collective bargaining changes. We say, fine, we'll talk about those topics, but you have radical proposals that you couldn't pass in Republican states. So let's be more practical. And the changes that he wants to make in those areas, for example, are so disproportionate to literally shutting down a budget and squandering an opportunity to, I mean, he talked about the state being downgraded in previous administrations. Our deficit got down to $3.5 billion from $9 billion. Now it's going to go back up to $14 billion. That's on him. That's not. We're willing to talk about the budget. He hasn't talked about the budget.
Can you say, as a Democrat, then your collective bargaining ideas are radical? We, as Democrats, can give ground on A, B, and C in terms of collective bargaining.
I have said that. I have said that, sure. And the Speaker has said in broader terms that he's willing to negotiate. But the few meetings we've had, he doesn't come off of his proposal to let an employer, a school district, decide that they're going to have to negotiate wages with the teachers union. Apparently, the governor thinks that the problems we have in Illinois is that the teachers make too much money, and we have to change that. And that just is, you know, it just doesn't, that's not logical. If you look at what happened in Wisconsin, you know, with Scott Walker, with all that drama and all the efforts, that was a Republican legislature that they barely passed that legislation. And it was much more limited than what he's proposing here. So there's an example of how disproportionate he is. And I think it's just maybe it's the fact that he hadn't been in the public sector at all, and his proposals in these legislation, it's like he wants to be the CEO of Illinois.
Well, you have. So have you said, we won't go for your plan, but here's a plan that we're willing to talk to you about on collective bargaining, on workers' comp.
Yes, in workers' comp, we've actually, yes, that's true. In workers' comp, we've already passed two bills. He didn't come in and say those are good ideas. We can let's tweak that a little bit. He hasn't done that. He's come in with dramatic proposals on workers' comp that undermine. Now, I would admit that there's other states that have done dramatic proposals on workers' comp, but we're against those proposals.
And have the Democrats thrown up their hands and said, okay, too radical, we're out of here? Have the Democrats come back and said, if you want to talk about collective bargaining, let's talk about, we're willing to give ground in this area.
I spent an hour with him yesterday. I asked for the meeting. I'm willing to talk to him about these things. He's got to move, and the budget is so important compared to these items. He's asking for way too much than could be reasonably expected, at the same time holding the whole budget hostage.
He did say today in the speech, he doesn't need to have it all, this turnaround agenda, he doesn't have to have it all this year, and he doesn't have to have everything that, in the way he's asked for. When you talked to him yesterday, did he give any indication about where he could come off of, where he could change?
There's probably some things that he's emphasized more than others. And workers' comp and collective bargaining are the two that he emphasizes. So to the extent that he had, 50 radical things and now he's down to 3 radical things, I guess that's supposed to make me try to meet him in the middle. I don't think that's fair. There still are things which are not practical, and they're not going to pass, and they're not even good ideas. But we're willing to try to give him something because we know that's what he's asked for. But we come back to the budget. This was a budget day. Did you get a sense of how do you write what the proposal was? What did he propose today? It's certainly not a balanced budget.
How out of whack is it?
We'll probably need more time on that, but just, the first brief estimate is about $3.5 billion.
So that doesn't count FY16 deficit.
Right. It doesn't do anything about paying off our growing new old bills. When we increased the revenues in 2011, all that money went to paying pensions and paying off debt. And don't tell me that bond rating agencies downgraded us because we had more revenues. They love more revenues. So that was another total misrepresentation today. The idea about the number of jobs since 2000, the dot-com, he takes the dot-com bubble, most jobs in the history of the United States, and every state is down from then, and uses that to try to skew that things are doing worse than they are. It's just not accurate. And it's been a year now. You'd think we'd get a little bit further along.
Sorry about that. Tim Newton just laid out several pension proposals, and I don't know if they were part of what you and the governor had talked about, but one of them dealt with reducing the end-of-year salary spike from 6% down to the rate of wage inflation, you know, for SURS and TRS. And then another one dealt with,
Well, no, we didn't discuss that yesterday, but the governor criticized me for not introducing my pension bill. It sounds like he hasn't introduced his pension bill yet either.
he's talking about smoothing of payments over 5 years.
Well, there's been proposals out there from everybody from Ralph Martieri and the Civic Federation to change the way in which you pay back. We'd have to alter the law that we've had for the last 20 years. The proposal that we gave the governor was the constitutional provision that we passed in a few years ago, Senate Bill 2404, that the unions had signed off on. That's the bill we talked about yesterday, and we're thinking about tweaking it. There's been some other Supreme Court decisions since then, the Cullerton decision, which alters what you can do for retirees, so they're exempt from any changes, and it's just difficult to pass. I appreciate the fact that he's for it. I appreciate the fact the Republican leader can get some of her members to vote for it, because half of them didn't vote for it before. It's complicated. It's called passing a bill. It's real hard. Passing a controversial bill when there's a bunch of people against it. He hasn't done that before.
The other piece was a $180,000 salary threshold for, you know, anybody making more than that extra amount would be passed on. It would be basically cost sharing, as we talked about.
Well, again, I haven't even seen it, and he didn't even tell me about it yesterday. So,
Senator,
we'll look at it.
in light of the Cullerton, where the Supreme Court saying that the
Healthcare
healthcare benefits are
right.
also guaranteed.
Yeah.
Is, two questions. One, is your approach to trading off benefits, I think your approach was before the Cullerton decision, and that you were going to trade off health benefits.
Yeah, let me explain it.
Is that still viable?
The bill that we passed with the union support had two provisions that were consideration. Okay, that's what you have in this contract. What you're basically saying is, in order for it to be constitutional, if someone's going to give up their pension benefits, they have to get something in return. That's a contract. There has to be, and that what they get in return is called consideration. In the bill we passed a number of years ago with union support, there were two provisions. You were getting a guarantee of health care, and you were getting the fact that all your future pay raises were going to be pensionable. The Cullerton decision took away that consideration for the health care, and as a result, we cannot in any way adversely affect any retirees' payments. So they're off the table. The only thing this bill would talk about is for younger workers who have future pay raises that they expect to get, they could guarantee that those pay raises will be part of their final pension, something they don't have now. And that's what they get for giving up their compounded COLA. So that's what we talked about. And it's constitutional, and it saves $1 billion a year. Nothing the first year, but then it starts to save money going forward. And so it's straightforward. It doesn't save as much as he would have liked, but the unions are against it, and it'll be very difficult to pass.
There's in the budget book, there's $3.5 billion that you talked about, which is cooperation, executive management, what have you, which is basically the let me do the cuts or we'll increase the taxes. Are you, together after we do the turnaround agenda, whatever that may be, are you willing to just say, okay, you go make $3.5 billion?
No, because they're not real cuts. I mean, they're For example, if you want to call a cut to take all of the money, $1.2 billion that we give to local governments, and just keep it, I mean, that's a cut, I guess, but I don't think it's a good public policy.
Okay, but
The only other place you can get that type of money would be to skip pension payments, and that's a bad idea.
okay, but you said today, again, he should have used a reduction in line item vetoes last year to cut whatever $4 billion that it was out of whack. Why not give him at least
Well,
some constraints?
because we then don't have anything to say about it. What if he wants to cut the providers' rates that we pay providers and for Medicaid, and we're one of the lowest in the nation right now? We might say that's going to hurt access. That's a bad idea. So we don't think that's a good idea. So we're not going to give you just open-ended authority to do that. I mean, quite frankly, most of the Democrats would say we've been cutting. Before you got here, we've been cutting. The Medicaid cuts were dramatic. We passed Tier 2 pensions, which cut dramatically the pension cost over time. The state government you're in charge of the state government contract, not us. So we would say, you know, we did a pretty good job on cutting. Our taxes are much lower than any state around us. Now, with regard to the taxes, I've said this before, this is really clear. If we're going to have a tax increase, it's going to be Bruce Rauner who decides we're going to have it. If he doesn't want to have a tax increase, we do not have the votes to pass it. So if we have a tax increase, it's up to Bruce Rauner. And if he says yes, the amount of the increase is totally up to Bruce Rauner, because we can't pass it without him. We can't pass a bill and override his veto. We can't pass it and then override his veto. So that's on him, okay? We're going to provide a lot of the votes. We're going to work with him on it. But this notion that we should pass his turnaround agenda, and then for our reward, the Democrats get to vote for a tax increase is kind of crazy.
You know, on public television, you disputed his characterization in a speech today that CPS was getting a really sweet deal from Springfield. How close, can you explain more why you dispute that, and then how close is CPS to like true insolvency?
The pension fund that they have is much better funded than the pension fund for the rest of the state's teachers. It's like 52% funded. The state teachers is 42%. You have to, the anomaly of the state of Illinois not paying the employer's portion for the entire state except for Chicago is got to change. As long as, if the state had been paying Chicago the same normal cost every year, Chicago wouldn't have had anything close to the problems they're having now. So that's the first thing we have to change. The second thing is, when you have the worst funding formula in the nation, because you don't concentrate money where there's a concentration of poverty, of course you're going to hurt a school district like North Chicago or East St. Louis or Chicago, because we have a high concentration of poverty. So there's the combination of not getting the money from the pensions that the other school districts do, and having this unfair formula. And if you just correct those two things, Chicago will be fine. And we're not going to go bankrupt. We're not going to have the state run the Chicago school system. It's just a matter of unfair funding that we can correct.
But I mean, you know, they came off of a bond issue though recently where they didn't get what they asked for. They didn't get as much money as they wanted. I mean, when we talk about insolvency, I know you say they're not bankrupt.
Because we passed a law years ago that said that Chicago had to start making pension payments, okay? And even though their pension system is stronger than the TRS, they're not getting, the city of Chicago is not getting this extra money like the TRS is. So we pay the TRS, the Teachers Retirement System, for the whole state except for Chicago. We pay the normal cost and we pay the legacy cost. That's why we're paying, you know, $9 billion in pension. We don't do that for Chicago. It's fundamentally a problem with the way their pensions have been funded. And they're not getting any other special deals, except for that block grant, which we would eliminate.